This recording is the second part of a series covering muscle tissue. This one is going to cover smooth muscle, while the previous one covered cardiac muscle. Now, smooth muscle is located in a number of different areas. And it's an important component of a large number of the systems in our body. Now, it lines blood vessels, which are part of the cardiovascular system, and it also lines, or covers, I should say more, cover the bronchi in the lungs, which are part of the respiratory system. And in the blood vessels, the smooth muscle's job is to regulate blood flow, while in the bronchi, it regulates airflow. Because both of them, if you contract or relax the smooth muscle, it can change the diameter of the blood vessels or the airways, which will influence the amount of air or blood they're going through those structures. Now, it is also an important component of the urinary and digestive systems. So what it's going to do, it's going to affect the movement through these systems. So in urinary system, urine, digestive system, food. In the digestive system, it also affects like the mixing type movements, like in the stomach and the small intestine to help with digestion. It's also going to be a component of sphincters, which determine the movement of substances from one place to the other. So if the sphincter is contracted, something's not going to move ahead. And it's also part of the reproductive system in that, say, the uterus has a lot of smooth muscle, and when that contracts, it helps with childbirth. It also lines the fallopian tubes, which will aid in the movement of the oocyte down the fallopian tube. In the male, it lines the vas deferens. It's kind of like the male equivalent to the fallopian tubes. So this helps to move sperm through the male reproductive tract. And so kind of overall, it helps movement of gametes through the reproductive system. It's also part of some of the glands, say in the male reproductive system. So it lines the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland. And so when it contracts, it helps to release secretions as part of the sperm, or that's part of semen, because semen is not just sperm, it's glandular secretions too. So the smooth muscle is a very important component of a number of body systems. Now, there are actually two types of smooth muscle. Now, the one that we talk about the most is the unitary smooth muscle, but I got to mention the multi-unit smooth muscle. Now, you find these in larger airways, arteries, oh, and I spelled this wrong, intrinsic eye muscles, so the pupillary muscles, the pupillary dilator, the pupillary constrictor muscles are smooth muscle. The erector pili muscles, which are involved in piloerection, are multi-unit smooth muscle. Now, these kind of act more kind of like skeletal muscle, in that they are not, or I was trying to use it, that they can have graded contractions, and it can involve motor unit recruitment. But they're unlike the unitary smooth muscle in that you don't really see gap junctions. They're going to kind of act more as individual cells, and they're spindle shaped. You notice the smooth muscle cells are spindle shaped, and they won't act as a functional syncytium because there are no gap junctions, and they also don't have automaticity. But the one that we talk about the most is visceral smooth muscle, or unitary smooth muscle. This is the one that we talk about when you talk about in your arterioles and the reproductive tract and the digestive tract. This is more common, and these will have gap junctions, so it allows them to kind of work as one, as a functional syncytium. And they also exhibit automaticity. So or they're myogenic in that the electrical impulse originates within the muscle itself. So what I want to do is look at the anatomy of the smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle, the cells are spindle-shaped. The actin and myosin are not organized in a regular arrangement. They have actin and myosin, but they're not regularly arranged, so they are not striated. What you'll also notice is the contractile proteins are kind of crisscross, so they spiral down along the long axis. And so actually when they contract, they get an appearance that looks, here, this looks like a corkscrew. So when they contract, it looks like a corkscrew. Can't spell corkscrew. But what you'll notice is the thick filaments are attached, or have a lot more, you can't see it here, but sorry. The thick filaments have more myosin heads, and please write this down, even though I didn't give you a little gap for this, is because they have a lot more myosin heads for every myosin filament, you get very powerful contractions from smooth muscle. More cross bridges, I want you to equate that to more powerful type contractions. And so I want you to think of it, any of you have had a childbirth, how powerful that smooth muscle contraction is, or even if you've had any intestinal discomfort, the powerful contractions that you can get when people have really bad diarrhea is sometimes very excruciating. So they can have very powerful contractions. Now the thin filaments which is actin, are attached to something called dense bodies. So here's dense bodies. So you see them right here. So they're not like in skeletal muscle, you had them attached to the Z line or the Z disc. Here they have dense bodies. The dense bodies are actually attached to the sarcolemma. And I had mentioned previously that due to the arrangement that we have in smooth muscle is when the muscle actually contracts, the muscle twists more like a corkscrew. Now, also another thing that they have, or should say they don't have, is they don't have T-tubules. Okay, so no T-tubules. These cells aren't very big, so you don't need these T-tubules go deep down into the muscle. But what they have is they have these things called calveoli. They're little indentations in the sarcolemma. And they say they may kind of act like a T-tubule will. And actually what they do is they store calcium. And they help to release it into the sarcoplasm. So they're going to kind of, I would write that down. They more store it. And so they're going to release it into here under the right stimulus. They also have very poorly developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. I'm just going to abbreviate it. Just like cardiac muscle, it's poorly developed. So it's going to have a very strong dependence upon calcium found in the extracellular fluid, which some of it is being stored right here in those calveoli. So like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, both have poorly developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the calcium needed for contraction, you're going to need some coming from the extracellular fluid. Skeletal muscle, all the calcium it needs is already within the cell. It's in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But in cardiac and smooth muscle, it's not. Now, the functional characteristics of smooth muscle, there's some differences from the other muscle tissues too, is we're going to look at how it's a little bit different in excitation-contraction coupling, length-tension relationships, energetics, as well as the control of contractions. Now, so the first one is, I don't want you to try to memorize all these steps because it's really not necessary, but I want to bring to your attention that there is no regulation by troponin. So troponin is not involved. So it's the regulation of the interaction between actin and myosin is not actin-based, it's myosin-based. And what's going to be important is this calcium binding protein called calmodulin. So this is going to be important in allowing ultimately the interaction between an actin and myosin. So what you'll notice is somehow calcium is coming into the cell that could be result of hormones, autonomic nervous system, a number of different factors that we don't have time to cover. But the calcium coming in from the extracellular fluid and calcium being released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium binds to something called calmodulin. And when calcium is bound to calmodulin, this is a protein that regulates an enzyme called a kinase. And the kinase is called the myosin light chain kinase. And what ultimately happens is it's going to cause the myosin head to be phosphorylated. And when the myosin head is phosphorylated, it then therefore can be active and interact with actin. So unlike what we saw with cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle, where troponin had to move tropomyosin out of the way, where tropomyosin covers a binding site for myosin on the actin, here it's nothing to do with troponin. Here we had to somehow phosphorylate the myosin head, or I should say not the I don't want to say the myosin head. I shouldn't say that. So it phosphorylates. Well, yeah, it does do the myosin head. So excuse me. So, but the phosphorylation of myosin by this kinase is going to allow the interaction. So that's where it's going to be different. Everything from there on, though, where you talk about the sliding and that type stuff, that's similar as we talked about with skeletal muscle. So the main thing to get from this is that troponin is not involved and that it's calmodulin that's going to be important, and it's myosin-based. It's not actin-based regulation. Now, also something that's a little bit different with the smooth muscle is there's no true neuromuscular junctions like you saw with skeletal muscle. What they have is they have these things called varicosities. So these little varicosities, you see these little kind of like little bulges here. Now the varicosities actually contain neurotransmitter, and there's a number of neurotransmitters that can be involved in smooth muscle. The excitation in smooth muscles actually uses a calcium action potential, which is kind of interesting, but again, I'm sorry, but we don't really have time to talk about it. But like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. The effects could be inhibitory or excitatory, all depends upon receptors. And so the sympathetic nervous system, which releases norepinephrine, give you an example, it can cause contraction or relaxation of smooth muscle. So example would be it can cause smooth muscle to contract via binding to alpha-1 adrenergic receptors, which we would see, say, on blood vessels. It would cause relaxation by binding to beta-2 adrenergic receptors. Okay? And you could always go back and look at the lecture on the autonomic nervous system. We gave you some examples there. Now, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released by the parasympathetic nervous system. And again, it can cause smooth muscle to either contract or relax, all depends on where you are. So for an example, if we're talking about digestion, it will cause the GI smooth muscle to contract, which helps with peristalsis, which is that forward movement or forward propulsion of material through the GI tract. Stalsis, it's SAS, or it helps with mixing type movements, but it will relax sphincters. There's a lot of different sphincters involved. So I'll give you an example. Sphincter of Oddi. This thing regulates the movement of bile and pancreatic enzymes and bicarbonate from the pancreas. Bile's coming from the gallbladder and the liver, and this is going to go into your small intestine. So it relaxes various sphincters. That's just one of them. but also we had talked about the internal urethral, internal anal sphincters. It would cause it to relax. Now there's hormones and local factors, and stretch can also influence smooth muscle. And so I'll give you some examples of things that would cause smooth muscle to contract. Something called vasopressin, which is otherwise known as antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. This causes vaso blood vessels to contract. Endothelin, which is released by the endothelium, which lines the blood vessels. And this is a vasoconstrictor. It's important if you damage a vessel to prevent blood loss. Oxytocin causes contraction of the smooth muscle that are part of, say, the reproductive tract, would be important in childbirth. And another thing that causes contraction is if you just stretch. This is a very important thing. One of the more important things, that if you stretch smooth muscle, it contracts. Just think about its importance in moving material through the digestive tract and the urinary tract. Now, other things that can cause smooth muscle to relax, things like adenosine, which is a breakdown product of ATP, and that's a very potent smooth muscle relaxer. And another one is something called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is produced by the endothelial cells that line the blood vessels, and this also causes smooth muscle to relax. Now, last couple things I want to mention very quickly is in smooth muscle, they don't exhibit the length-tension relationship that you saw with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, you have this optimal resting length. If you overstretched it or you compressed it, you wouldn't get the optimal amount of tension. Well, this, in smooth muscle, it exhibits what we refer to as plasticity. Now, you may have heard this term before, like when they talk about the brain, when they refer to plasticity in the brain, they talk about the brain's ability to reorganize its neural pathways throughout our lifespan, depending upon our experiences. So, and pretty much our ability to change with learning. Well, this is kind of similar in that here, the smooth muscle can function over a wide range and length, so it can adapt and adjust its resting length. So if you stretch, think about, the best case example I can think of is a woman who's pregnant. That baby is growing and growing, and her uterus is stretching and stretching. And you think, well, say, when she wants to give birth, if that's overstretched, if it was like skeletal muscle, there would be a very weak contraction that would happen. But no, just ask any woman who's actually given birth naturally, is that it will adapt and be able to have a very powerful contraction when necessary. So it has this plasticity. Another cool thing about smooth muscle is that it can maintain tension for a very long period of time with very little energy expenditure. Just think about the smooth muscle lines blood vessels. There's always a certain amount of tension in those blood vessels, and it helps maintain your blood pressure. But there's not a lot of energy expended for that, which is kind of a good thing. So it has, it's very efficient, let's say, put it this way. So it's very efficient compared to some of the other muscles. So this is going to be the end of the recording covering smooth muscle. I recommend looking at the table at the end of your notes that compares skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, and use that for study purposes.